Welcome to another episode of Becoming a Tech
Culture.
Wizard. And as we get into this, it's just going to jump right in. It's going to be a long episode. Left off on, I think, sections 2 and 3. So we're going to get into 4 and 6. And the Hegel complete phenomenology of spirit. So without further ado, here we go.
And its laborious emergence from the immediacy of substantial life must always begin by getting acquainted with general principles and points of view, so as at first to work up to a general conception of the real issue, as well as learning to support and refute the general conception with reasons. Then, to apprehend the rich and concrete abundance of life by differential classification, and finally to give accurate instruction and pass serious judgment upon it. From its very beginning, culture must leave room for the earnestness of life in its concrete richness. This leads the way to an experience of the real issue. And even when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths by serious speculative effort, this kind of knowing and judging will still retain its appropriate place in ordinary conversation.
Before you even explain it, I like to try to take it apart myself. So let me go back a little bit. Culture must leave room for the earnestness of life and its concrete richness. This leads to the way to an experience of the real issue. And even when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths by serious speculative effort, this kind of knowing and judging will still retain its appropriate place in ordinary conversation. So yeah, there's a lot to be said here. Basically, what we were talking about before, kind of leaving off. Maybe it's not a good thing to start code. I need to kind of recap what sections 1, 2, and 3 was about, which is the universality, about how it's about having a dialectic. Probably missing a few other things, but this idea that there is no, it's not about what's false and what's true. It's about kind of being in that process of figuring out, what is going on here. So yeah, from its very beginning, culture must leave room for the earnestness of life and its concrete. Yeah, so this continues that process, that idea that the richness, the value of this is in the process, is in the actions of talking about it and thinking about it and things like that. Even when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths by serious speculative effort, this kind of knowing and judging will still retain its appropriate place in ordinary conversation. So yeah, even when we figure out, the result, even when we get a result or a conclusion or whatever, there's still a lot to be learned and gained from just thinking about it and taking that process of trying to tackle those same ideas again, just so we can internalize those ideas and things like
The
that.
way to an experience penetrated to its depth, appropriate place in ordinary conversation.
So let's see what he has to say about it.
Okay, now this is a very short and very important, dense little paragraph. There's quite a lot going on here, not only because Hegel is bringing in a bunch of new conceptions that are fleshing out his idea of what it is that he's aiming at, what it is that he attempts to produce in his work, but because these are going to play a major role in the very structure of the work. So he starts out talking about culture, and I think that when we see this word culture, we don't want to assume automatically culture as a finished thing. We want to think about the process of becoming culture, because quite often that's what he's going to be focusing on. So he's talking about culture and its laborious emergence. Emergence from what? From what he calls substantial life. Now this requires some lingering over this and some explanation. Hegel thinks that in many societies and in many people's experience, they are, at the point that he's looking at them, caught up in what he calls substantial life, where, think about this term substance. Substances are what are real, what actually are out there, the things you can bump into. They're the things that matter. They have value. Oftentimes there's sort of a self-evidency about them. So your substantial life as a student could include things like needing to buy your books. You just sort of take that for granted as part of student life. But then somebody could come along and say, why buy books? Why not simply rent them? Why not get an electronic version of the text that perhaps you can download through a torrent? Not advising this, by the way. Just pointing it out as a way in which the unity and the sort of sleepiness of substantial life can be shaken and then broken. And somebody says,
Right.
oh, yeah, now they're actually posed with, what should I do? Before, I was just going to go this way and I wasn't even going to think about it. Now I have to decide, do I go this way or this way or this way? Which one's better? How do I figure out which one is better? I have to, discuss this. And you could fall back into substantial life. He calls this immediacy, meaning that.
Real quick, it's crazy because just this morning I made a podcast where an audio journal, my kind of daily audio journal where I was talking about this idea, right? Where a lot of people automatically have I call it a solid foundation, right? They think they have a solid foundation of any idea, right? Whether it's a political idea or cultural or scientific, even religious, especially, right? Where they have this concept that they think they know, right? What's going on in life, and they think they know some truth, some objective truth. But in reality, that truth is not true, right? It's not objectively true because we have no way of knowing what is objective truth. This is why we do science. This is why we do all these things to try and figure out what that truth is, because it's the process, right? And so if you think that your idea of something is solid, quote unquote solid, then what you're actually doing is leaving yourself open for disruption, for when somebody else comes along and criticizes you, they basically crack your solid foundation that you built your house on, that you built your identity on. And then you feel defensive, you feel offensive, you feel, fear maybe because you built all this stuff on top of what you thought was a solid idea. Versus if you instead have a constellation, I call it constellation. If you have a kind of vague idea that, hey, instead of saying, so to kind of, bring this home, instead of saying, the only way to read books is to read it, physically, right? That's the only way to read books. If you have that idea, you have a solid idea that this is the way to do things, then when somebody else says, oh, no, you don't have to read books like that. You can read it on, on your phone. You can read it in the bathroom. You can read it on a hologram, or you can have it downloaded into your brain. You're not going to be open to that. If you think the only way to read books is through a physical, construct, and you have to flip the pages, right? You've kind of stratified your mind, versus if you realize that reading books is just one method of getting information into your head. Another example I use is, before we didn't realize the everything that was in space. Before, people had this idea of the sky. Maybe before they thought, the Earth was the center of the universe or whatever, right? And of course, with religious people, you have this idea that you have heaven up there. And so if you have this idea that you have heaven up there, then when a scientist or somebody else says, hey, no, there's actually, we can actually see up there. We don't see no man in the sky up there. We see a ball of gas, a really hot ball of gas. We see a bunch of planets. We see, stuff like that. And you're like, huh, what? Like if you stratify yourself into this idea of what something is and not keep your mind open to the idea that this can change, then you really limit yourself to what you can learn and grow. Anyways, that ended up going longer and off base from what he was talking about here. But I just found that kind of connection there. I just found that interesting, that kind of get into this today when I was just talking about that this morning, or something similar this morning. So anyway. Ooh.
There's nothing mediating it. It is just mediating itself. It's sort of what in other philosophical traditions, the later phenomenology of Husserl, they would call the natural attitude, or when Hume, or when Kant was talking about his dogmatic slumber, that could be something like substantial life. So what is culture? Culture is coming out of substantial life, not necessarily throwing it away altogether or demonizing it, saying, it's terrible, it's horrible, we have to always be thinking constantly and examining everything, don't ever take anything for granted. That can, by the way, become its own substantial life, the hippy-dippy, question everything. That turns into its own kind of weird, constricted substantial life that Hegel calls skepticism later on. In any case, culture is an emergence from substantial life through acquiring general principles. General principles are something more than just following along with the rules, kind of, not blindly, but unthinkingly. General principles are things that you can actually identify as, hey, these are principles. Now that you may have good principles or bad principles, he's not concerned about it at that point. But having general principles allows you to arrive at a articulate thought or conception, a way of seeing things, a Gedanke in this, of what? Of the real issue, of what it is that you want to study. So again, if we want to use power relations, in real life worlds, or what other people call cultures, not what Hegel's calling culture, culturation, you have all sorts of power relations. Some people are higher, some people are lower. There's expectations that go along with it. Habits help form this. Reward and punishment affect this. And people come to sort of take this as this is just the way things are. And then they start thinking about general principles. Well, why are things this way? Well, because it's better for all of society. Or the ancestors decided this. So then you start thinking in terms of general principles, and there's a critical element to this. So if the ancestors went along with this, does this mean that everything that the ancestors did is automatically good?
Right.
How do we apply that principle? And you start to arrive at more and more sophisticated, more and more self-articulating forms of thought. And those are what allow you to pull yourself out of substantial life. So, and that's what allows you to understand the thing, the Sache. If you want to understand power relations, you have to exercise your mind and exude a sort of dissolving substance to a certain degree thereby. There was a famous philosopher, I can't remember who it was, he was a materialist, who said the mind secretes thoughts the way that the stomach secretes, or the liver secretes bile. And I think Hegel would sort of go along with that. The active mind actually secretes thoughts which cling to things, which, latch into them. Thoughts are an active process. So to think about power relations is already, in a certain respect, to begin to question them. I mean, you might come back to the point where you say, hey, I'm all for them. Whoever's on top, good for you. Everyone else should obey. But that's different than the sort of unthinking, dreamy, sleepy, substantial life.
Right. Don't just accept it just because it is.
What does the person end up learning how to do who is culture? I only put one thing.
Go through that process of learning why it is that way. Like, why are we here? Like, why do we do the things that we do? Because by questioning it, you can probably figure out a better way to do it, or a reason why we're here. And so you're not following orders just because, or unquestioningly you're following orders. If you do want to follow orders, if you do find that to be the right way, you're doing so because you actually know and believe that it is the right thing to do, and it's usually more powerful that way. If you follow orders, or if you think authority figures, all this stuff is wrong. So either way, it's just a good practice to get into.
Thing up your classification. But Hegel talks about being able to support or being able to contradict or criticize the general conception that one has by giving reasons, by considering, arguments, we could say. To apprehend the rich and concrete abundance of life by differential classification. Differential classification means saying how things are actually different from each other. So going back to power relations once again as an example, merely an example, the person now, by having some sort of way of looking at things, some sort of theoretical way of looking at things, is able to begin classifying things in the realm of concrete experience. And doing that act of classification, helps make these things more understandable, more intelligible. It removes them from their immediacy, because now they're mediated through the classification. To be able to give accurate instruction and pass serious judgment upon it. Part of culture is passing on culture. Every generation of students that come into our classrooms, for us educators, are in the place where we were, in my case, a generation ago, for some professors 2 generations ago, for some professors newly minted, just where they were a few years before. And what we have to do to them, what we have to awaken in them, what we have to inculcate in them is what was done with us. And it's going to be somewhat different from case to case to case, of course. Not always going to be.
In the process, you decide what should go on to the next generation, right? You decide what is going to stay alive in your culture. That process is judging, right? The process is analyzing, is determining why you're using certain things and if you think it should continue. And that's definitely something we need more of today, to see how many of the things that we have today are things that we should continue using, and why should we continue using them?
Stamping out a process of mere imitation or mere replication. We're helping them to become cultured. To become cultured for Hegel means to be able to think about things, to pull yourself out of the society, the way of thinking that everybody else around you has, and think in general terms be able to hold on to those thoughts, be able to provide reasons, to be able to think about that, to think about thinking, to be able to classify, and to be able to teach others, to be able to pass that on, and to be able to pronounce judgments that are not just some made up, pulled out of the air feeling or opinion, but actually have some sort of basis. So this is what culture consists of. We might think about it as culture and education and development all rolled into one. So he says, from its very beginning, culture must leave room for the earnestness of life and its concrete richness. Our lived lives are extremely rich if we actually pay attention to what's going on in them. Right. You know, people talk these days about mindfulness. People like Hegel were doing mindfulness and doing it on, you know, infinitely higher power than these mindfulness practitioners that go around and get paid for doing these workshops today even suspect. Because he's saying our immediate lives, if we pay attention to them, are extremely rich. The problem is we need to be able to make sense out of what is actually going on in them. So we have a sort of fork in the road at this point. He says, even when the real issue has been penetrated to its depths by serious speculative effort, and that's sort of what he's sketching out here, it's always possible for us to fall back into this. I think a lot of educators themselves fall back into a kind of substantial life of how they conceive education and how everybody else talks about it. You know, I see this happening in a lot of different venues, education theory, and you know what people call assessment, which you know sometimes isn't really assessment, course design, all these sorts of things. It's easy to fall into a kind of analog to groupthink. And I don't want to use the word groupthink because it has these sinister connotations because of 1984. Just think of it as sort of a nice warm womb in which the nutrients are constantly flowing and there's not a lot of struggle required. Real thought, for Hegel, requires struggle.
Struggle, yeah. Goodness, that's powerful right there. You said it really well, but it's just so crazy because I was literally talking about this same thing this morning in my freaking audio journal. So it's just the coincidences. And this is kind of leading me more and more towards, you know, that anarchy that I was talking about before in my, you know, my last video. I usually do on Fridays, but I did it yesterday on Thursday. And just like when you question things, when you realize, when you actually see, okay, why do we have this? You know, is it the right way of going things? When you engage with these conversations and everything like that, when you engage with these ideas, it allows a richer kind of space in your mind to think about those ideas. But in our society today, we don't really have very many, unfortunately, of those sessions, of those, you know, and of that encouragement for people to really question and at least engage in the thinking process of why we do what we do, or why our society is set up this way. It's kind of just taught to you that says, oh yes, this is our history and we got here today and hurrah, right? It's not much critique going on. It's not much struggle, as he says. You know, even when people do are contrarian or things like that or skeptical, they might not do so with the purpose of actually engaging with the idea. They just do so just to be contrarian, just to be like, oh nope, that's not the way to go. But okay, so what is the way to go? Like, what should we do? You know, if you don't engage in that practice of thinking about those alternatives or why we're here or why we do the things that we do or anything like that, then you're not really engaging in the dialectic. You know, you're not really doing that full thinking, that full thought process. And it really requires you to think about these things from different perspectives and get into the depths of it, and to, even when you see a good conclusion or result, to not just accept it just because it is, but to engage with it, engage with why, you know, that conclusion is the way it is. So this is beautiful. I really wish this was taught more widely. Like this is really crazy. Taught as in we should engage it more widely, not just, oh yes, here's Hegel and just read a book. No, we should have classes in which people are making discussions just like this, like, you know, reading paragraph by paragraph and talking about what you think about the paragraph, not just, oh, let's the reading assignment, read it and write an essay about it. No, we have to engage in it. You have to read it, take your time with it, talk back and forth, see what you think, see what other people think, and all this stuff. You know, that's what allows us to get in that practice.
The true shape in which truth exists can only be the scientific system of such truth. To help bring philosophy closer to the form of science, to the goal where it can lay aside the title love of knowing and be actual knowing, that is what I have set myself to do. The inner necessity that knowing should be science lies in its nature, and only the systematic exposition of philosophy itself provides it. But the
I'm gonna slow this down back. Slow it back down a little bit. The inner necessity that knowing should be science lies in this nature, and only the systematic exposition of philosophy provides it. Only the process of that, of engaging with the knowledge of the learning, allows you to really get into that knowing what nature is. Very, very apropos right there. It's very. This is great. With the external necessity, so far as it is grasped in the general array, setting aside accidental matters of person and motivation, is the same as the inner, or in other words, it lies in the shape in which time sets forth the sequential existence of its moments.
External necessity, so far as it is grasped in a general way, setting aside accidental matters of person and motivation, is the same as the inner, or in other words, it lies in the shape in which time sets forth the sequential existence of its moments. To show that now is the time for philosophy to be raised to the status of a science would therefore be the only true justification of any effort that has this aim. For to do so would demonstrate the necessity of the aim, would indeed at the same time be the accomplishing of it. The necessity of the aim would indeed at the same time be the accomplishing of it.
So therefore be the only true justification. So I think this one is especially poignant in terms of the context of which, I guess it actually still is poignant today, because I was thinking like before, again, I think he mentioned this before, but like philosophy was like known as a different sort of science, or rather philosophy was all the general thing, right? And natural sciences, what we deem as science today, was one type of philosophy. If I'm mistaken that, right? Or maybe I might have it backwards, where philosophy was type of science, and natural philosophy became known as what is known as science today. Probably roughly starting around this time, but today it's like it often seems like philosophy is not really deemed as a science today. It's more like a social science, or like a it just stands kind of separate. Some people say because you can't do experimental experiments with it, basically, and stuff like that. I don't know the arguments exactly why, but nonetheless, it's not really part of the conversation of science, right? And I think this is saying that it should be raised to the same status. Demonstrate the necessity of the aim would indeed at the same time be the accomplishing of it. It's a weird way of writing. I'm not gonna lie. It's like this is a complicated way of writing. And I'm sleepy. I should have taken a nap before I did this, but but to do so would demonstrate the necessity of the aim, and indeed at the same time the accomplishing of it. I guess kind of going back to that knowing should be science is in its nature. I don't know. I probably should have took a nap, y'all, because like I get it, but I don't get it,
But of any effort that has.
That's why we have the explanations as well. That will help out.
In this section, Hegel is really charting out for you in a very positive, straightforward way some of the main themes and thrusts of this work. And he's got this great catchphrase, which may bother some people, depending on their theory of truth. He talks about the true shape of truth. Oftentimes when you see this word shape or structure, you want to think in terms of gestalt, and that's an important term for Hegel. The true form, the true mode, the manifestation, the true articulateness of
What
it.
about Gestalt and time?
It's possible for truth in Hegel's system, or a truth at a certain point, to be less than fully true. That may be a little mind-blowing for some. How can true actually be sort of a...
Yeah, just kind of get into what I was talking about earlier. Like we can't really have a real complete idea of what is objective, right? So what is truth is like what is objectively true and always true or whatever, and the truth is that the truth of that, of the truth is that we don't quite know. I don't think we'll ever be able to know, but we can always know more, right? We can always get closer to it. And that's kind of like the process of it. Maybe it's a limitation of our minds, a limitation of being a non-omniscient being, but to know truth, I think, would necessitate to be far beyond what any of us could be as singular thinking beings, as singular species, as a singular brain, or anything like that. Like it has to be something bigger that contains everything, that is able to understand and know all that truth, because there's so much to it. And so even if you try to know the truth of like a relatively simple, idea or object like water, or this cup or something like that, there's an almost infinite amount of detail that you can get into that gets to a better, truth. Just because you know vaguely what something does or how it works doesn't mean you know everything how it works, or in every situation, or in every way of how it works and stuff like that. So at least that's how I'm seeing it so far.
Predicate of itself. But we'll get to that. Some of these things you have to sort of take on faith until we get a little bit further on in the phenomenology. That was part of the point that he was making about how hard it is to write a preface. But truth is going to be a criteria for itself. And this is not a completely new idea. The medievals had this conception of the truth is actually the criterion for itself and for falsity. Now, truth is something for Hegel that develops, that is active, that involves a sort of subjectivity and a sort of agency. So truth is going to be able to reflect upon itself at certain points and say, well, I'm not completely true. I need to be truer than I am.
Mm-hmm.
Really interesting thought. That's going to be a lot of fun for us to pull out. Now, Hegel will say that the only way in which truth, in a philosophical sense, and that means in the best sense for Hegel, right? The best, most expansive, most encompassing sense, the only way in which that is going to be able to be fully presented, fully consolidated, is in terms of a scientific system of truth. So that means taking in truths in the multiple and making them all part of one big truth without distorting them in the process, without, leaving parts out that don't fit. You have to find some way to actually synthesize all of this together. Huge challenge. And you have to do so in a systematic way. That means that things can't all just be left out like on a workbench, cluttered up. They can't all be placed into their compartments and have no connection with each other. Their integral connections with each other have to be part of the very system.
Crazy. I was literally talking about that same thing too. It's like everything's interconnected, everything's interwoven. Especially today we have this problem with desire to put everything into a category, a label, and say this is that. But in actuality, in real life, these labels are just labels. They're just things that we made up to describe the world. In reality, everything is kind of interwoven, interplaying, and we just don't know how, right? We just don't know to what extent. But we pretend that it's completely, separated. That, your politics has nothing to do with your religion, has nothing to do with, your day-to-day activities, has nothing to do with this. Like, no, it all interplays, right? It's a question of how it interplays and to what extent it interplays. And if you don't realize that, then you won't have a good system of truth. If you just think that this is this, and you can keep it separate, you're already off to a bad start. And yeah, this seems like again, very powerful.
System itself. The system itself has to be scientific, meaning that it has to be oriented towards knowledge that is actually assured of itself as knowledge. That's not how we often think of science. When we do think of that, we usually think of the scientific method and hypothesis, and then it starts to get very hazy for most of us because we've forgotten what we learned in our high school science classes or the college classes that we had to take. But the experimental method is really only part of what makes science science. It's also being able to provide explanations that can be correlated to other things. And actually, philosophers of science and scientists themselves often get into debates and disputes about precisely what counts as science, precisely what scientific method entails. So it's not quite as cut and dry as people would like to think. For Hegel, to be scientific means that it is going to necessarily be systematic, and it's oriented towards generating a type of knowledge. So he says, for philosophy, the question is it going to remain just love of knowing? That drives it. Or is it going to proceed to actual knowing? Is philosophy going to quit puttering around, or quit developing, quit being something potential, and become something actual, become actual knowledge articulated in a systematic way, scientifically, to provide an understanding of the totality without leaving anything out, putting each thing in its appropriate place, including the one who is putting things in place. Paul Order. So he says, the inner necessity that knowing should be science lies in its nature. Knowledge, by its very nature, wants to be science. It desires to become science. It wants you to think about, a bit of knowledge doesn't just want to sit in your head by itself. It wants to be correlated to other things. It wants to be brought into a system with other parts as sort of moments of a constellation, moments of a greater whole. And you can go along with that or you can resist it. And some of our habits tend to resist that. So he says the external necessity, so far as it's grasped in a general way, setting aside accidental matters of person and motivation, here's how we want to be scientific, is the same as the inner. Or in other words, it lies in the shape in which time sets forth the sequential existence of its moments. Remember we talked about development before? That's part of what it means to have this scientific, systematic way of looking at things. It doesn't mean, by the way, that you would have to totally exclude your own personality, your own concrete experience from things. But we do want to generalize. We do want to learn how to, as we just said in the previous section, go through that process of becoming cultured. That is part of the process of attaining truth for Hegel.
Right.
So, what else do we have in here? There's a clarion call that's taking place here, and this is really important. He says, to show that now is the time for philosophy to be raised to the status of a science. What that would mean is philosophy, as actual knowing, actually becomes science. It hasn't been so before. That's why the scientists, and that's why the somewhat skeptical philosophers like Kant in some of his writings, and definitely Hume, can say the history of philosophy up until this point has been a history of errors. There's nothing scientific about it. You know why? Because it's never actually been fully brought to its realization in actual knowing through some sort of scientific system of truth. These go together with each other. Hegel's saying the time is now, and who's the guy to pull it off? Hegel. Not because Hegel is, himself smarter than Plato or Aristotle. He is pretty brilliant. I mean, you have to give him that. But he doesn't think of himself as more brilliant than those guys. He happens to occupy the right time and place. This process of development has been occurring through the centuries, through the millennia, and not just in philosophy, but through all the different things that fall under culture, like law, like politics, like economics, like religion, like art. All of these have been leading up to a crux in a person who's now going to be in the right place at the right time to finally bring philosophy to the level of development that it has been desiring to be at without fully understanding what that would mean this entire time.
And even now, it's like we're getting to a point where it seems a lot of science requires a philosophical understanding of the world. What I mean by that is like when you look into what's going on with quantum physics right now, right? How nothing is quote unquote real, right? It's all probabilities. You can't look at that and be like, oh, it's whatever. You have to have some. I think it kind of inspires some sort of philosophical understanding of what that means for the world, right? If at the basis of our world, everything is just probabilities. Like what? When you look into relativity, general relativity, and stuff like that, like the fact that at the basis of that world, everything is relative. Space and time is relative. The space and time that we take advantage of, that we, it just seems like it really inspires you to have some sort of philosophical understanding for how all of this kind of comes together. Same thing for if you're going deep into biology, like how everything kind of all ecosystems, ecohabitats, kind of build upon each other. If you take something out, it ruins the system. And all, like when you really study these things, even computers, right? If you really look into artificial intelligence and software engineering and hardware and all this stuff, and you looking at how it works, you're just like, whoa. Like once you get deep into these things, you have to, I think, I'm not gonna say you have to, because a lot of people don't, but still, like, I think it really inspires, engenders a philosophical desire, yearning for that systematic approach, for what this means for how everything kind of comes together in the universe. Not just not a meaning per se, but a system, like how it's all connected. And so if anything, I would say like this is a better time and place. And maybe in 100 years and 200 years, they'll say that that is a better time and place. And that could be true. It could all be true. So because it's a constant process, right? That true shape of truth is an infinite, eternal kind of search for that for that truth.
Time. This is why he says, to show that now is the time for philosophy to be raised to the status of a science would be the only true justification of any effort that has this aim. The proof of whether Hegel is successful lies in the entirety of the phenomenology of spirit, this entire system. In order to pass judgment upon Hegel, what that means is, if he's right about this, you would have to be able to go through and understand all of the moments and all of the dialectics, all of the shapes of consciousness, and the entire process of development, and then you'd be able to say, yeah, I think he got it right, or he got it wrong in these respects. By the way, I actually do think that he got it wrong in certain respects, and that the dialectic is not as simple as he made it out to be. And I'm not the only person who thinks so. Really, if you're going to philosophize after Hegel and want to be, in some respect, a dialectical philosopher, you probably have to disagree with him on that respect, or on that topic. But before you do that, you need to actually see how all these things fit together. Hegel's saying the only way that you can adequately judge the system as a whole is on the basis of looking at the system as a whole, not just part of it, definitely not just the thesis, antithesis, synthesis triangle, and saying, oh, that doesn't apply to everything. Hegel would say that's not exactly what we mean by scientific system.
Wow. So this kind of gets back into that, because again, this whole preface is just him saying, I don't think we can do a preface to a book of philosophy. And this is why, like, his whole system is a system. It's ideally a cohesive explanation of everything. And so if you just look at the preface, just first few paragraphs of the book, and be like, yes, I have a good understanding now of what he's gonna be talking about. I have a good understanding of what his conclusion is getting to, and kind of Spark Notes approach. Like, no, that's not gonna tell you what his system is. You might have a rough, very vague idea of what the system might get into, but it's not the system. You have to read the whole thing. Good way to say, hey, if you ever read the entire book and talked about it and thought about it, you can't say whether I'm right or wrong. You have to actually read my book, go through the process, think about it, and break down how you think it's wrong and where you think it's wrong. You can't just say, oh, it's wrong. You have to, if you want to, bust them down, you have to participate in the dialectic. That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
To lay down that the true shape of truth is scientific, or what is the same thing, to maintain that truth has only the notion as the element of its existence seems, I know, to contradict a view which is in our time as prevalent as it is pretentious, and to go against what that view implies. Some explanation, therefore, seems to be called for, even though it must for the present be no more than a bare assertion, like the view that it contradicts. If, namely, the true exists only in what, or better, as what, is sometimes called intuition, sometimes immediate knowledge of the absolute, religion, or being, not at the center of divine love, but the being of divine love itself, then what is required in the exposition of philosophy is, from this viewpoint, rather the opposite of the form of the notion. For the absolute is not supposed to be comprehended, it is supposed to be felt and intuited. Not the notion of the absolute, but the feeling and intuition of it must govern what is said and be expressed by it.
Again, get into that idea that objectivity is just too big, right? The true nature, the true shape of truth is too much for any one man, any one human, any one being to really know. What we can do is try to experience it, right? Try to intuit, try to get into what it's like within the system, to think about it. So yeah, this dude is great, man. This dude is great. Like, sheesh. This is intense.
Now, in this section, Hegel is going to begin to engage in some more criticism of some of the prevalent points of view in the world of thought of his own time. And he's starting out by saying, if it's really the case that the shape of truth is necessarily scientific, Or put in another way, or what's equivalent to it, to say that truth has only the notion, and we'll come back to that in a moment, as the element of its existence. Then what implications does that have? That means that oversimplifying ways of trying to apprehend truth are not going to be successful. They may appear to be successful, and that's exactly what's wrong with them, that they can actually seduce you off the path, the laborious, systematic, process-oriented path to truth, and think that you can sort of just shoot yourself like a cannonball directly at the real, at the matter itself, at the truth, and that you can actually arrive there. So what is he going to contrast to this in this paragraph?
Can't have a
He brings up this term, I'll put a dividing line here, intuition.
I'll be hitting it.
There are some, and they included philosophers, who would say that in order to grasp truth, you can't do it in any sort of mediated way, any sort of conceptual, systematic, scientific way. It has to be through intuition. It has to be, when we say intuition, what we mean is some sort of direct, unmediated grasp of truth or reality. So some people, talk about mystical experience in terms like this. Mystical experience is a very deep and vexed topic, so I don't want to overgeneralize. But some people use the word mystical basically to mean things that are matters of intuition. You can also say that some things are matters of intuition necessarily. Sensation to a certain extent fits into that. How do you know if you're in pain? Well, you actually feel that you're in pain. Of course, it's not quite so simple once we start looking at it carefully and we start realizing that pain is a relationship between nerves and the brain and how we feel about things and external things. Now suddenly it's actually mediated. But some people have this notion that you could have an unmediated, direct apprehension of truth. Not only that you could, but that's the way it has to be. So, for example, Spinoza, who Hegel liked quite a bit for some parts of his philosophy, Spinoza thinks that ultimately we need to have a type of knowledge that's of substance or God, that is not like the discursive kind of knowledge that we have. Hegel would say, no, discursive knowledge is where it's at, and this is where this word notion comes in. It also gets translated in other versions as concept. And this is a really important bit of Hegel's philosophy. Begriff in German is what's being translated here. And begreifen means literally to sort of like grip onto, right? And if you think about it, when you're wrapping your mind around something, you're not just like having one sort of lightning bolt of intuition. You're doing a process where you're kind of think about feeling somebody's face and their features and figuring out who they are. And maybe being, maybe it's enjoyable, or maybe you're horrified by what you find on their face. There's parts to the process, and those parts are all connected to each other in one main structure or gestalt, one main whole. And the parts of that whole are things that you can just take away and have the same thing, the same experience, the same understanding, the same comprehension. Philosophy, as the study of the real, as the study of the totality, as the study of what's most true, even the nature of truth, Hegel thinks can't afford to lapse into flights of intuition, but has to try to work out things in terms of the notion, in terms of a scientific, systematic understanding of things. So he says, if the true exists only in what, or better as what, is sometimes called intuition, sometimes immediate knowledge of the absolute, religion, or being, not at the center of divine love, but the being of divine love itself. I mean, this is part of what makes it so attractive to talk about intuition, because it's like, I want to have a direct experience. I don't want my experience mediated with words and concepts and knowledge. I want to have the thing itself right on top of me or in me, or I want to be in it. I want to experience reality directly. Some people try to do this, by the way, through their senses. They figure, hey, if I just get out there and surf, or if I get myself into a fight, or they try to do, or having sex, for a moment I'll like experience unmediated reality itself. But that's the problem, one moment.
Oh, this is cool. This is cool. So how I'm understanding it so far, like what we said before, knowing something is the action of knowing, is the action of thinking about it and talking about it. And so this intuition piece is like the experience of really conceiving an object. Like, I'm trying to think of an idea that most of us probably have a good intuitive sense of. That's the problem, right? It gets, oh, wow. I guess into that what he was talking about, the substantial life, right? The substantial whatever you're saying there is like if I say water, right? Do we have an intuitive sense of water? You might think you do, but you never really thought about. You might not have ever thought about how much water you need to drink every day, right? How important the water is to your body. The fact that your body is made up of 70-80% water, and yet you don't see the water. Like, how is it that my body's made up of mostly water, And yet I look nothing like a cup of water, right? This is complete water. And this is like, this is 70-80%. Like, why is that last bit so make all the difference? You know, why is it that water can fall from the sky, and you can have ice water, you can have, all this, like, why? Like, so if you just say water, if you just think about water or drinking water, does that really give you an intuitive sense of what water truly is, of the essence of water, right? Like, or color, right? If you think about the color red, do you think this is a common thing? Like, yes, you get an intuitive sense of red, but we know for a fact that you can use red in really interesting ways for different artistic principles. So when you just think about red, you don't necessarily get the same experience as if, the red, if you cut yourself, or better, the bright red in a artistic canvas where somebody has portrayed that red to give you a certain emotion, right? So it's like, when you actually think about these things, you get a better feeling of what that experience is. And so you can't just read some books and be like, yeah, yeah, I get it. Like, no, you have to engage in it, So it's so interesting. Like, even the common things that we kind of take for granted. That's what I was looking for before. Things that we take for granted all the time is so easily fallen into that space of the substantial life of the kind of surface level approach of understanding things. We think we have an intuitive understanding of it, but really we don't. Really, there's so much more there. And in order to understand it, in order to appreciate it on a higher level, in order to understand the bigger truth of it, right? The shape of the truth, the full shape of the full truth, you have to engage in it. So that is beautiful. That's really great.
And from a Hegelian perspective, that one moment thing isn't even that one moment. All you remember is your reconstruction of that later on. And that's not quite the same thing as something that sustains over time, that you can actually carry around with you as an integral part of who you are. So he says, the absolute is not supposed to be comprehended for these people. It's supposed to be felt, intuited. Not the notion of the absolute, but the feeling and intuition of it must govern what is said and must be expressed by it. Hegel thinks that this is a fundamentally misguided way of going about things. And now, it's worth thinking for a moment, before we go on to the next section, why would people as sophisticated as, for example, Spinoza, say we need to have this intuitive knowledge, this third type of knowledge in Spinoza's case, of what is most real? It's really, from Hegel's perspective, a failure of nerve. It's not an optimism, it's really a kind of pessimism about our own human capacity to make our way to the absolute by way of progressively, integratively synthesizing knowledge, bit by bit by bit, painful bit, quite often laborious bit, which is an achievement for us. Intuition is kind of cheap, like the easy man's way. And the problem that he's going to talk about a little bit later on, you don't know whether your intuition is actually an intuition of something, or whether you're just kind of making it up, or whether your neurons are kind of spinning out.
Right, that's what I was just saying.
So he's engaging in some...
I'm not going to lie, I kind of mistook. I thought he was saying you have to have an intuition of truth, but there's different levels to the intuition, right? It's like after you engage in the idea, then you can gain a certain intuition of what that idea is. You get a better understanding of that intuition. But that intuition is itself a kind of, it's a constant process. Why? And maybe that I was kind of misunderstanding, because I had that in my mind, where earlier in my podcast, in my audio journey, I was talking about how truth is a constant process. We will never know everything. Like, my personal belief so far, I might be wrong, but is that we will never know everything. And so every day or every moment, or whatever, it's about how much you want to learn. No, it's about knowing that there is always more to learn. So you can have an intuition of the truth, but the intuition is always going to be insufficient. There's always going to be more, right? You can understand a little bit about water by thinking about how much it affects your body and all this other stuff. But then there's even more things to know about water, right? And if you really want to know everything there is to know about water, you're going to be here for all of existence, probably trying to figure all that stuff out, trying to intuitively understand all of that stuff, right? And that's what I was thinking. It looks like he's saying, like, no, you can't have any intuition, or having an intuition of truth is not the same as having a system of truth, right? And I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think you can have a system and an intuition. And in fact, they interplay off of each other. Having an intuition feeds into what your system is, and having a system allows you to have better intuitions of that truth. I think at least that's how I'm understanding it. That's how I'm thinking about it so far. But I do understand what you're saying here, where you can't really have an intuition of truth, or having intuition is like a kind of surface level approach, because like I said earlier, you can have a wrong intuition, right? You can think you have an intuition, you can think you understand something, but really you don't. When somebody else says, hey, look at this, when you read something, you say, oh, wow, I learned something new. That shows you that what you thought you knew, right? Your intuition was wrong. And so therefore you never even had an idea of truth. And so it's better to try to work up the nerve, right? Work up the effort to build a whole system of it, which is painful and scary, and, it takes a lot of work, but it's worth it. It's the whole endeavor.
Criticism here in this section, and he's going to continue this criticism for a bit as well in other sections.
Whew, that was great. That was absolutely fantastic of section. We're just in the preface. It's been 3 weeks. We just in the preface. This is gonna be a long time. This is gonna be a long, process. But I'm super excited about it. As you can tell, probably I've learned so much, even though I'm tired. But it's just so great. So yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Hope you learned something. Hope you've kind of enjoyed this, even a little bit as much as me. And hope you engage in this yourself. Go and read the book. Go ahead and look at this channel, and do this process yourself. So yeah, that's everything. That's me. Have a great day. See ya. Goodbye. Bye bye.